All right, well, thank you. It's a joy to be with you. And first of all, let me say I fully endorse and applaud the work that Jim and Nancy have done over the years. It's great when you have someone of their stature that has brought this issue to everyone's attention in the fashion in which it gets results. And their book is a wonderful book, and I say that not merely because they gave favorable mentions to Terry Collins and I, but it really is a very good read. I think what Jim failed to acknowledge, though, is that a number of the things that he's addressed in that book, the legislature has already acted on, thanks to Jim. And me, and that's very true. Jim and I collaborated on a very important legislation, Senate Bill 77, which passed before this task force ever started its work. And that made sweeping reforms in lineup procedures, in evidence retention procedures, in incentivizing the recording of confessions by audio or visual means. It was really a landmark bill, and many of the things that the American Bar Association criticized Ohio for in its 2007 report, we actually remediated in Senate Bill 77. And I believe this was after Jim was out of being State Attorney General. He just came back and helped us, and it was great legislation. My own credentials on this matter go beyond introducing Jim Petro to Mark Godsey, although that was a fortuitous introduction and has led to all the good things that you've heard about from Jim and Nancy. But I've also myself worked very closely with Stephen Johnson Grove and the folks at the Ohio Justice and Policy Center, not only on individual cases. Right now we're seeking clemency for a lady named Tyra Patterson in Montgomery County. Jim, I think you're involved in that too. The case involving Mr. Hawkins, which was a commutation from death to life. Jim, you and I were involved in that, convincing Governor Kasich to grant that clemency. And I've been involved in all of the very important criminal justice reform bills that have passed in the last 3 years. House Bill 86, the Sentencing Reform Bill, Senate Bill 337, the Collateral Sanctions Bill, Senate Bill 143, which was sort of a grandson of those two. And we've made a lot of very positive changes. So my credentials on this are pretty good, and so don't mistake the rest of my talk for being opposed to what Jim and Nancy are talking about. I'm for what they're talking about. But I think it's important for everybody to understand that a task force can make any damn fool recommendations it wants to. They are not going to become law unless either the legislature enacts them or the courts change the rules to accommodate those recommendations. I served on the task force. I'm the only member of the panel today that did. And I served on the task force. We met generally in all-day sessions over the course of 2 years. The task force consisted of some 25 people. There were a number of defense lawyers, academics, judges, some legislators, a very few prosecutors, and a representative of the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. The task force came up with 56 recommendations. I don't know if you want the good news or the bad news first, but the good news is a dissenting report was filed by the prosecutors and the Attorney General. And their representatives on the task force, which was Prosecutor O'Brien from Franklin County, Prosecutor Dieters from Hamilton County, and a representative of Mike DeWine, they dissented from 25 of the 56 recommendations. So I think it's fair to say the good news is they did not dissent from 31 of the 56 recommendations, and that's a good thing. I dissented along with Representative Margie Condit and Judge Roger Wilson from Champaign County from only 11 of the 56 recommendations. I recognized that the prosecutors had some other valid points to make, but I thought we could work around those points. And I guess we can talk about the specific recommendations, though there's hardly time. But the overarching theme of my objection was, folks, if you go too far in the recommendations you're making, the likelihood is that the entire report, with all of its good recommendations that have achieved broad consensus, will fall by the wayside too. And most legislators, there were only a handful of us on the task force. Out of 132 members of the General Assembly, there might be a grand total of 4 that know what's even in the report. The rest of them know only what the prosecutors had to say, which is that this is all a bunch of left-wing bunkum and it all ought to be discarded. And so the difficulty is in trying to get the recommendations put into legislative form. Now, I want to thank my dear friend Congresswoman Schmidt, who is in her time off when she's not teaching college, and she's brought a few of her college students with her today to watch the proceedings. But Jean has helped me try to triage these recommendations into a series of 4 or 5 bills. No one would dare try to put all 56 in one bill. That would be stupid. And by the way, about half of them can be affected by changing court rule and do not require legislation. So Jean has been helpful in trying to triage these into bite-sized pieces. The legislature generally likes bite-sized pieces when it comes to controversial things. But I think I know whereof I talk, and I think Jim and Terry will back me up on this. I started working on sentencing reform with Terry Collins. And I went through 3 directors of the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections before we got it done. So I started with Terry under Ted Strickland, and then we had Director Moore, whose first name? Ernie Moore. We had Director Ernie Moore, and then we got Director Gary Moore, and finally under Director Gary Moore, we got it done, okay? Already there are elements in the legislature that are trying to undo what we just did. And surprisingly, and I don't mean to get political, this is not a political rally, but I want to point something out to you. I know you're an anti-death penalty crowd for the most part, but I think you need to know some of the worst offenders on criminal justice sentencing reform and on this topic of the death penalty are Democrats. The prosecutors in Cuyahoga County, Montgomery County, and Summit County are all Democrats and have been forever. They indict more cases in Cuyahoga County than anywhere else. Summit County is the Democrat prosecutor that wouldn't even return Jim Petro's phone calls till we got the actual cigarette butt with the guy's DNA on it. And Montgomery County is fighting tooth and tongue on all of these cases, and they have a Democrat prosecutor. It is a Democrat state representative that is trying to repeal the sentencing reforms that Terry and I worked on that took us 4 years to get there. So I say all this not to be political, but to say to you who are probably by inclination Democrats yourselves, folks, you have met the enemy and it is us. The Republicans have been the ones that have shepherded sentencing reform through. The Republicans have been the ones that have made these changes in evidence retention, in lineup procedures, in incentivizing the use of DNA, in granting prisoners more right to get DNA paid for at state expense. Those have all been Republican initiatives. So, there is an educational job to do with both Republicans and Democrats on something as complicated as a 56, this is just the recommendations. It took 10 pages just to write the 56 recommendations. And so my goal is to move this from a Saturday afternoon soiree into some level of legislative accomplishment, because otherwise we're just flapping our jaw here. And so hopefully we're going to be able next session to triage this report into those things which are achievable. One of the first priorities I have is to get a change in state law that prevents the execution of the mentally ill. The Supreme Court has already said, the Supreme Court of the United States has already said we cannot administer the death penalty to the mentally retarded. But those people that are seriously mentally ill, either at the time of commission of the crime or at the time of their scheduled execution, to me, hardly fall into the category of the worst that we should be executing. I think we certainly need to improve the accreditation procedures in our coroner's offices. And we came up with several recommendations in this report that do just that. It would deal with the accreditation of crime labs. If the crime lab is not accredited under our report, the defendant will have the right to test that evidence in an accredited lab at the state's expense. So rather than mandate accreditation of every fingerprint lab in every police department, we came up with an alternate way of incentivizing folks to get accredited and of providing the defendant with a stopgap measure whereby they can have at their expense, at the state's expense, the evidence retested by an accredited lab. I see I have 1 more minute. We haven't even scratched the surface of the 56 recommendations, but let me just conclude by saying this. There is a lot of work to be done. This is not the greatest priority for the General Assembly. They all want to talk about jobs and taxes. The work of criminal justice reform is not sexy. It is difficult to overcome the opposition of prosecutors, and it is a long slog. You must learn to be patient, and you must learn to settle for the art of what can be achieved rather than trying to hit home runs. And I say that as someone that's labored in this vineyard for about 6 or 7 years now, and I know my panelist friends are nodding their head because they know I'm right. Thank you.